Hello, everyone. On this beautiful evening, I'm here in Cambridge. It's 24 degrees outside. The streets are full of happy people with happy thoughts. For the first time, we opened up yesterday from our lockdown, so people are allowed again in the streets, and it's a really, really great atmosphere outside. And thank you very much for joining us on this beautiful evening to this webinar that is entitled "The Autobiographical Impulse in the Medieval Mediterranean." My name is Miriam Wagner. I am the Executive Director of the Woolf Institute, and I'm also the Editor-in-Chief of Al-Mazaq, which is the journal of the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean, and this is what it looks like. It's a beautiful green cover, which Antonella, the president of the society, and I often try to emulate in our clothing, green dresses. Unfortunately, not tonight. We forgot to wear our green dresses tonight. So this journal is a fantastic journal, and the subscription to it comes as part of the membership to the society, and Antonella will talk a little bit more about the society later. This webinar tonight is the sixth webinar in a series of collaborations between the Woolf Institute and the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean. We also have a few other partners on board. We have the CSIC IMF, the University of Liege, and the Medieval Studies Research Group at the University of Lincoln. So Antonella will talk a bit more about the society, but I want to say a few words about the Woolf Institute. For those of you who don't know the Woolf Institute, we are a research institution in Cambridge. We focus on religion and society, and we combine our research with teaching, with publication, and with policy work. Most of our work is concerned with contemporary social sciences, but we also understand the importance of historical research. So quite a few of our researchers and our students work on historical themes, including myself. A very quick introduction on how this webinar works. We have a Zoom webinar audience, and we also are live streaming via Facebook. So if you want to rewatch this, or if you want to recommend it to anyone, it is available after we finish this from the Institute, Woolf Institute Facebook page, and also very soon on our YouTube channel. As for the structure of the webinar, we have a panel discussion. We have 3 panelists here. We have a chair. They will talk for about 20-25 minutes. And then we'll have probably a short question round among ourselves here while you can prepare questions for the Q&A. Please put them in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen. Try not to put them in the chat because it's more difficult for the chair to handle both the chat and the Q&A. So if you want a question to be asked, please put it in the Q&A box. And I think this is time now to introduce our chair, Dr. Antonella Iutsoscorpo, from the University of Lincoln, who works on the cultural history of Iberia, and she is going to introduce you to the panelists. Over to you, Antonella.
Thank you very much, Miriam. Welcome, everyone. As Miriam said, you can tell that we are all happy because it's sunny and we are relatively out of lockdown, so that makes a good starting point. So just a brief outline of the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean that Miriam mentioned already, that, as you know, is a society dedicated to all aspects of the academic study of Mediterranean history and culture from the 5th to the 15th century. And the society aims to foster cross-cultural and interdisciplinary investigation to create a forum of discussion, really, and encourage debate on cross-pollination within the medieval Mediterranean. The society, alongside obviously having the journal, but also organizes biennial conferences. You might have been with us Barcelona 2 years ago, and we hope you can be with us in 2022 in Crete, hopefully in person. We also award biennial book prizes and essay prizes. There's a book award, and there is also the Simon Barton Postgraduate Prize and Early Career Prize. If you want to find out more about the society, please do check our shiny website, where you also will find more information about how to join the society and the kind of subscriptions that are available. So let's introduce the panel, but actually before introducing our speakers, I'd like to tell you a brief story, and it's the story of a productive international scholarly collaboration that started back in 2015 at Kalamazoo with a panel that Aphrodisia organized, and that then evolved in the following years to become an informal international research networks involving the four of us, so Franz, Jaume, Aphrodisia, and myself, at a time, I should say, when we used to create ad hoc accounts with unheard of platforms to video call, when none of us even knew about Zoom and many other now daily used collaboration tools. And yet we managed. We even managed to organize a symposium at the New York University campus in Florence in 2018, when we gathered together scholars of different disciplines, including philosophy, history, and literary studies, to discuss expressions, meanings, and representations of the autobiographical impulse in the premodern period. That finally in-person symposium was really a springboard of ideas and approaches that we did and we would like to pursue further. So most of what came out of such a thought-provoking discussion converged really within four main areas. We talked about identity and or versus individuality, agency, autobiography, but beyond kind of the strict parameters of a genre per se. And we talked about approaches and chronology from the pre to the postmodern period. Now, focusing on the medieval Mediterranean, today we're going to explore some of these questions in conversation with our brilliant panelists, and we would like to welcome your ideas, your input, and your comments in the Q&A session. And as Miriam reminded you, please do put them in the Q&A box, because that's going to make my life easier, so I don't have to check 10,000 boxes and taking the risk of missing some of your questions. So it is a great pleasure for me today to welcome our speakers. I'm going to introduce them in order of appearance. We are leaving Aphrodisia last simply because she has been teaching on campus right until now, so she might use a few more minutes to recover. So we start with Jaume Aurel, who's professor of medieval history at the University of Navarre, so in Spain. His research interests are multiple, and they include history and autobiography, medieval political theology, royal self-coronation, and medieval historiography. These interests are witnessed by some of his major publications. I'm not going to list all of them, but you might be familiar with Author in the Past, History and Autobiography and Politics in Medieval Catalonia, and then his recent work on medieval self-coronation, published by Cambridge University Press in 2020. So thanks, Jaume, for being with us today. Then the second speaker will be Franz Joseph Arlingaues, who's professor of history at Bielefeld University, so in Germany, and his research focuses on the high and late medieval period. His interests are numerous, and they cover from urban history, history of literacy, history of rituals and performances, history of law, to history and individuality. Now, it would take quite a while, and also a good German pronunciation, which I'm afraid I'm lacking, to list all his publications. So I'll just mention some of them, such as the edited volume on forms of individuality and literacy in medieval and early modern periods, published in 2015. And then more recently, from 2020, there's a new book written in collaboration with Walter Earnhardt, Lina Gumpert, and Simon Szymanowski on comparing the self. So thanks, Franz, for being with us today. And last but certainly not least is Dr. Aphrodisia McCannon. Aphrodisia received her PhD in comparative literature from the University of California, Berkeley. And for the past decade, she has taught in liberal studies at Global Humanities School at New York University. She currently sits on the editorial board of two medieval journals, Postmedieval and Viator, and she's also in the steering committee of Medievalist of Color. Her research interests are, again, numerous, but she mainly focused on medieval memoirs and autobiography and uncommon expressions of medieval subjectivity. But she's also interested in intellectual thought of the 19th and 20th centuries, particularly as it pertains to the Middle Ages. In fact, her latest articles that I will invite you to read on Émile Mall and premodern pleasure, beauty, colonial discourse, and the Middle Ages is an example of this. She's also very interested in how modern concerns inflicted from the Middle Ages can better medieval studies, which is an open discussion at the moment. So thank you to all our panelists, and we are going to start with Jaume Aurel, that today will share some view on historical autobiography focusing on Catalonia.
Thank you very much, Antonella, for organizing this. I'm very honored to be here, and Miriam and all the people who are organizing this. Can you hear me well, Antonella? Excellent. So yes, in brief minutes, I can introduce my interest in historical autobiography so that people can ask me or we can debate some aspects of this. When I started analyzing Catalan historiography, medieval Catalan historiography, I approached the modern linguistics or modern literary critics, and they told me that it was not possible to find autobiography in the Middle Ages. This is a commonplace, but I think it's interesting to start with this point, because when I start reading my sources, I didn't agree that first approach, because I realized that in my sources they were narrations in first person and talking about the deeds that these persons had experienced. So little by little, I realized that there is much to break about the established literary conventions in this sense. So I would like to start with this because there is a huge subject here, which is autobiography in the Middle Ages or not. This is the first question that is interesting to address. So anyway, for the Catalan sources, I was amazed that the medieval Catalan historiography has represented 5 big genres. They start with the typical annals, that's very schematic and clear successions of chronological events. This was about 10th century. Catalonia, as people know, was part of the margins of the Carolingian Empire. So it was very important for Catalonia to have a particular specific history based on some basic events. Some people tend to think that annals are just schematic, so that they are not, they have not ideology, but it's full of ideology. If we choose one event over the other, it's obvious that there is a lot of ideology here, or at least intention to narrate the story in one way. So the second big genre practiced by Catalan chronicles was the genealogy, which is another typical genre in medieval Europe, especially spread in 12th century. There is a very clear example there in Catalonia, the Gesta Comitum Barcinonensium, the story of the Counts of Barcelona. This was middle 12th century. And then, as we say in Spanish, de repente, suddenly, we find an amazing autobiography. There is no other name for this, and Antonella can confirm or not if she thinks another way, because she knows very well this source, is the Llibre dels Fets of the King Jaume I, 13th century. Llibre dels Fets may be perfectly translated in English as Book of the Deeds. If I pronounce well, deeds, I think it's the events, no? So it's interesting because scholars don't find exactly the explanation why this king decided to explain the history of his kingdom, narrating his story. There are several theories here, some of them very interesting, connected with the Islamic tradition on autobiographical, let's say, narrations. This is not easy to follow, but some scholars support this theory. I am more interested in another theory which connects this with texts on crusades, like Robert of Clary, Jean de Janville, and they explain the crusades, excuse me, the experience on the crusades in first person. This was second part of the 12th century, so Jaume I conceived his autobiography at the beginning of the 13th century, and his is actually, in some sense, a story of a crusade too, because he explains very, very, very clear, very well and very detailed the conquests of Valencia and Majorca. So this is one of the texts I wanted just to introduce. And the second text is 1 century after Jaume I's Llibre dels Fets, his, let's say, the third generation after Jaume I, Peter the Ceremonious, which is Peter IV of Aragon, he wrote another autobiography, which is more or less called the book, simply the book, in which he explains his theory on how a kingdom has to be ruled, and he does this explaining again his own experiences. It's obvious that Peter the Ceremonious is based his experience and his way to writing on his grandfather, because there is one nice passage of the Chronicle in which the same King Peter explains that he was in a beautiful morning reading the memories of his grandparent. So it's obvious, it's one of the few clear clues in the Middle Ages that we can have access of the sources of the in this case of a chronicler. So that's very interesting, because he was inspired in his grandparent, but he organized the chronicle in a very, very different way, because it's not like Jaume I's chronicle, which was event and then after event after event after event. Peter the Ceremonious has lots of ideas to expose, and then he explained them with some stories, which is very interesting the very different way to organize this. And I will finish this brief introduction, because I think it's just a brief introduction, saying that there is another two big differences between the two texts. It seems to be that Jaume I dictated his memories to other people in the court, who then wrote the texts, and they sent back the text back to the king, and then the king finally gave the final version. The Chronicle of the Peter the Ceremonious was very different, had a very different process, because we have kept, which is amazing, a very interesting source, the minutas, I don't know this word, Antonella, in English, the schemes, very, very guidelines, perhaps works here.
Draft,
exactly, draft. And then we can follow the first draft, and then how the workers in the court, they made some changes in this draft, and this draft went back to the king, and then the king, there are 2 or 3 changes. So it's a written process. It's a very different. That's why Peter the Ceremonious Chronicle is much more a political treatise than simply a memories. I think it's enough, Antonella, unless you want me to speak something more, but I think as introduction is just wanted to say.
Thank you, Jaume. That's fantastic, and that was a very very brief but very dense overview, so I'm sure there will be plenty of questions, well, at least from me afterwards. So thanks for that. And now we're going to move on to a slightly different area of the Western Mediterranean. We're going to go to Italy to find out more about different concepts of autobiographical text and individuality in modern and pre-modern times. And we're going to look at the case of Bongianni Gianfigliazzi in 15th century Florence with France. Thank you.
Thank you. Memory that on the 12th December 1478 at about 15 o'clock, a Saturday, my daughter Marietta was born from Maddalena, my legitimate wife. She was baptized on the 13th of that month. I made a dowry of 800 florins at the Monte delle Dotti on 30th of May 1479, which will be due on 30th of May 1494, when she will be 15 years old. Bongianni Gianfigliazzi is the name of the man who, short after the birth of his daughter, seems to take care of her future by investing quite some money for her dowry. But life, like so often, did work out as planned. The next two sentences read, on 7th December 1480, a Thursday, at 1730 o'clock, Marietta died. But I didn't get the money back of the dowry from the bank until 3rd December 1484. While it was somewhat strange to see that Gianfigliazzi didn't express any joy when writing about the birth of his child, it is even more strange to read that the first thing that seemed to cross his mind after the death of Marietta was, how do I get my money back? To be sure, the way the dowry was made always was important to him to note when he wrote about the birth of a baby girl. And he had quite a few of them. And when 11 years earlier, in 1468, his daughter Maria died shortly after he made the dowry, the only thing worthwhile to annotate was that he got the investment back right away. Now, some of you may have come across the heartbreaking story of Giovanni Morelli told about the death of his son Alberto, 9 years old, so perfectly interpreted by Richard Trexler. Morelli was a Florentine citizen as Gianfigliazzi, and both belonged to the same layers of society. As for the moment, the following questions lay on the table. Did Gianfigliazzi have a heart of stone? Or, to put it with Christian Beck's reading of such writing, do we see here the first step of a capitalistic mentality that, even though the father might have felt sorrow about the loss of his child, at the end of the day would ask what that meant business-wise? Or are we mistaken altogether because the book we are consulting is just a part of bookkeeping, and it would be somewhat strange to expect the expressions of feelings in such a genre? As for the last question, the Recordanze of Bongianni Gianfigliazzi, so carefully edited by Luciano Pifanelli in 2014, contains all kinds of entries, concerning money, family, birth, and death, and even events like the killing of the Duke of Milan in 1476. At best, the Gianfigliazzi's book may be called a libro di famiglia, a typical genre invented by the urban elite of Tuscany, mostly. Little stories about land purchase form part of such books. In 1474, a long entry informs us about how Gianfigliazzi bought a property for a very favorable price from the commune, and how this tormented his consciousness. The land in question, and now it's getting a bit complicated, the land in question belonged to his deceased brother Gerardo and his sister-in-law Lena. It was confiscated by the city authorities due to tax problems. However, Lena and Gerardo, in her testament, wanted that the property to serve as an endowment to cure their souls. But that never materialized because the authorities had stepped in. So because Gianfigliazzi had bought the property for a very cheap price, and because the souls of his brother and sister-in-law did not profit from this endowment, in order to clear his consciousness, he wanted that certain amounts of grain and money be donated to a vast number of altars and churches in Florence. He wanted this precisely as a remedy for the souls of Lena and Gerardo, so not even directly for himself and his spiritual well-being. Now, this caretaker and wrecked by remorse Gianfigliazzi does not fit to the presumably heart of stone Gianfigliazzi that, when writing about the death of his daughter, is only interested in money. How do we solve this riddle? First of all, the question would be, what is worth to be documented in such a book? Libro di Famiglia, I mean. Libri di Famiglia are not diaries, not even autobiographies. Rather, they are to be read and consulted by relatives and friends. They want to portray the author as an exponent of the family that matches the ideals and values of that given family and the society as a whole. What we consider authentic and inner feeling that would come as a part of a personality and character is just not shared by this type of literary genre, and maybe not even of late medieval Italy as such. Now, that doesn't mean that people did not mourn or suffer when beloved ones died. They certainly did, but the way they did so, the place they attributed in their writings, as well as their self-description, seems different from today, and I think very different. That brings me back to the second point. The endangered souls of Lena and Gerardo and his troubled consciousness made Gianfigliazzi write about his inner thoughts and feelings, lead him, in our view, to open up a bit. It would be too easy to read this as another example of a typical medieval world where faith and religion was more important than today, I think. Rather, I would suggest to interpret this as a manifestation of a conflict with basic concepts of how things ought to be, of a general order of the world. I already mentioned Alberto Morelli, who died at the age of 9, which caused so much trouble, especially to his father Giovanni. As it turns out, the real reason for Giovanni's unrest was that he didn't allow his son to confess before dying. More than an element of faith, it turns out to be a missing link in performing the right ritual before leaving this world. Or as Richard Trexler wrote, a classical case of imperfectly ritualized death, end of quote. The way to correct this mistake in Giovanni Morelli's story is to perform a number of ceremonies and ritualistic acts. And of course, they are linked to religion, no doubt about that. Back to Gianfigliazzi, and I only need 1 minute now, and his personality or individuality. The suggestion would be that we should not so much look for presumably authentic emotions that would resemble what we would consider authentic emotions. We should not so much look for an inner self in high or late medieval autobiographical text that resembles how we would understand inner self. Rather, we should calculate that self-esteem and personality take on a form completely different from present-day individuality. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Franz. That was fantastic, and loads of new good ideas about emotions. I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. And last but not least is now Aphrodisia's turn. So Aphrodisia has been working on autobiography for a long time, approaching it mostly from a literary perspective. So thank you in advance for offering us an overview of your research, talking about your experience of looking for medieval autobiography. So thanks, Aphrodisia.
Hello, thank you, everyone. I wanted to thank, as the last speaker, the Woolf Institute and the Society for the Medieval World and CSIC Lincoln and Liege for giving us this, this platform. So I got interested in medieval autobiography through the Life of Saint Louis, the Vie de Saint Louis by Jean de Joinville. I first read the text in a course in graduate school that was cross-listed in history and in French. The text was presented to me as a 13th century historical chronicle of Louis IX's First Crusade. As a literature student, my reaction to it was that it read much more like an autobiography than a chronicle. It is strikingly told in the first person. And for those of you that know the text, you'll remember that much of it concerns not the later canonized king, St. Louis, but the author, right? His perceptions, his experiences. But as a student, I soon learned that there were not a lot of autobiographies in the Middle Ages. And it was, it's a genre that really didn't exist then. And that the academic narrative was that autobiography, as we've often come to know it, really began with Rousseau's Confessions. Now, there were several examples of religious autobiographies, description of men and women's religious experiences, or autobiographical writing in the context of confession, but very few of what we might call secular autobiographies. And I remember people, particularly those outside medieval studies, suggesting that in the Middle Ages, people didn't have a sense of self, which explained why there was no autobiography, right? No sense of self, no writing about the self. First of all, the concept of no sense of self never made any sense to me. A sense of self seemed like a basic definition of human consciousness, but further, I thought it was really problematic because if you could decide that there was a moment in time when people lacked this basic human quality, you could start cherry picking when and where people do and don't have this quality that makes you fully human. And I read this particular analysis of the Middle Ages as just a potentially dangerous intellectual move. So I kind of went on a quest to find autobiography in the Middle Ages, using as a springboard Jean de Joinville's text. Let me share with you an excerpt of the text, a tiny excerpt of it. The majority of this text takes place in and around the Mediterranean. In this excerpt, the Crusaders have their first military encounter during the landing at Damietta in Egypt. The author, Jean de Joinville, is not waiting for the king. In fact, passing Louis IX's ship, races towards the shore and lands, in his account, first on Damietta. So quickly share my screen here. That's not it. 1 second. There it is. Okay. We came up alongside the boat attached to the king's great ship with the king aboard. His people on board began to yell because we were going more quickly than they, and they told me to land beside the standard of Saint Denis, which was being borne on another ship in front of the king's. However, I paid them no attention, but on the contrary, landed my men in front of a great body of Turks at a place where there were fully 6,000 men on horseback. I'm going to stop sharing. I don't have time for a full analysis of this little excerpt, but for me, the essential question for this and other parts of the text were, what part of that was the life of St. Louis, right? With its focus on I and me and my and we, its disregard for the king's ship and the symbols of France, its sense of personal triumph. This seemed so much more the life of Joinville. And it was really tempting to say, okay, I've done it. I've found autobiography in the Middle Ages. You just have to get rid of this pretense that this text is about St. Louis, and then we have, secular medieval autobiography. But I think that would do an injustice to the text, because the king is a major part of it. And shortly after the author's triumphant arrival that I just read, he gives a similar description to the king. The text really seems to be more of a hybrid, chronicle, memoir, biography, which led me to think that since the modern form of autobiography doesn't really exist in the Middle Ages, that you might have to look for what I call the medieval autobiographical impulse couched in other genres. And if that were the case, it was going to be kind of hard to track down examples of autobiography. So I went on yet another mission to find it, issuing like several calls of papers asking researchers if in their study of something else, they found traces of autobiography. And there were many interesting texts and images that came to surface, like Franz was talking about the family books, for example. To conclude, as modern autobiography studies suggests, there are many, many forms that autobiography can take, including hybrid biography autobiographies that we find in Joinville's text. I'm still convinced that the desire to write about or express the self is part of our shared human nature. And if we can't find it in a particular time or a particular culture, it's only because we're not looking in the right places. Thank you.
Thank you, Aphrodisia. That was fantastic. So thanks to all our speakers. As a reminder, I can see there are already questions in the Q&A, and just a reminder for everyone in our audience, please do feel free to put your questions in the Q&A, and we are also cross-checking what's happening on Facebook in case there are any questions there. So I had a question, but I think I will give priority to the questions that are already in the chat, starting from Juliana Dresbina. Apologies if I didn't pronounce correctly your surname. For Aphrodisia, so she's suggesting, well, she's saying, first of all, thank you for your presentation. It is indeed so important to stress the hybridity of these narratives, and she's wondering, what do you think about self-narrative or life writings as terms to identify such complex hybrid text?
Yeah, we've had a lot of discussions as to what to call what we find in the Middle Ages, and I think the term that we sort of came up with was just autobiographical impulse, because that way you get to the root of what's causing the expression, as opposed to trying to label exactly what the expression is. But I think any of those terms will sort of work as long as you are sort of precise sort of about the term. Our little sort of scholarly collective in our group, the autobiographical impulse really seemed to be able to capture all of the kinds of works that we found.
Thanks, Aphrodisia. There's a question that is for all panelists that links, I guess, also with this, and is from Panagiotis Antopoulos, and again, I hope I pronounced this correctly. A question to all of you. So, working on autobiographies and on memoirs, do you feel that literary topoi enter into their narrative to a substantial extent, as with historical text, or they're almost devoid of them? So to what extent do you think that's the case?
I can start answering if you want, Antonella.
Perfect, thank you.
In my view, there is a very interesting interaction between the self and the historical facts that they want to narrate. To me, when they choose a form, a literary form, a genre, this is part of the content. I mean, when the kings decided to explain their life or the story of the king in first person, they are not dividing his person, his life, and then the history of the kingdom. This is very interesting for me, because it means that for their mentality, they represent the whole kingdom. What I don't understand exactly if for literary topoi, Panagiotis, you refer the literary methods or genre, or the historical topoi. That's why I don't understand very well. But my first approach of this question is that the same person is they represent the kingdom, so that they feel that using the first person, in the case of John I, the first person in plural, which is very interesting, nos, we, it's like representing all the kingdom? This is my first thoughts about this question, Antonella.
Thank you, Jaume.
Answer that as well. You know, being a student of literature, I was very sensitive to sort of literary themes that would show up in some of these texts, and particularly with Tranville, which is the text I know best. Definitely, you can feel that he is using sort of chivalric literature and sort of what he's gained from chivalric literature to describe sort of the actions of his men, of the king, and sort of others, that he's drawing from even the epics of rebellion when he talks about some of the sort of breakaway actions that some of the men on the crusade sort of do. So I think that you know, it depends on the text, certainly, but for the historical chronicles that I've been researching, there is a nice nexus between sort of epics and chivalric literature and these texts that have this autobiographical impulse in them.
Thanks, Aphrodisia. Franz?
Yeah, well, I cannot agree more, of course, but I would like to take it a bit further. We already talked, and Aphrodisia pointed out that we have here to deal with hybrid texts in a way. And I think, Santi, you also talked about this, you know, as Santi just said, the person and the kingdom somehow mingles or are entangled. And that would mean if you take this a little bit further, you don't only find topoi, but you also find values that are attributed as well as to persons and to, let's say, things like the realm or a kingship or something like that. So while for me, there's no question that there is, of course, a self in the Middle Ages and a strong self. I mean, the self-esteem is sometimes astonishing, even for simple folks. But the question here is not, is there a self or not? For at least for me as a medievalist, what kind of self, what quality, what kind of self is this? And here I see a big difference between, let's say, time after Rousseau and time before Rousseau, because before Rousseau, it's not an accident that we almost only find hybrid texts, because the personality and the self is more conceptualized as hybridization of the self mingled with others. And the self-esteem comes from not to be, I'm completely different, which in my view is a modern view of the self, but I'm better than the rest, I'm better than other kings, I'm better than other merchants, something like that. So being better still means building up a relationship between what is there, between the group, for instance, or values, or you name it, and the self, while being completely different at least suggests that I'm completely, well, as the word goes, completely different from what is around me, from other folks or something like that. Well, that's a myth, of course, but that's how I would say modern autobiographies tend to work. And then, of course, they still portray themselves as, you know, similar to blah, blah, blah. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. The questions keep coming up, so I'm going to merge two questions here, the one from Anaïs Wag and the follow-up from Juliana, and it's about, and it's for all panelists, and he's talking actually about what you think about letters, potentially as a sort of hybrid autobiographical text, to use Aphrodisia's definition. Particularly, Anaïs here suggests, for example, the letters between relatives. She's using the case here of Louis IX's letter to their mother Blanche of Castile about the capture of Damietta. So what do we make of letters as possibly hybrid forms of autobiographies?
Did you want to speak? All right. I would like to hear so much more about letters in all of the panels I've put together about autobiography. I have never had someone sort of present letters as a, you know, as a almost an obvious space of sort of the autobiographical impulse. So next time that we put out a call for paper, if you are working on letters, I would love to see somebody work onto the hybrid nature of that particular genre. That would be great.
Jaume?
Okay, yes, Antonella, if you remember, and Franz and Aphrodisia, we decided the word impulse exactly precisely for this kind of sources. I think for me it's very, it's nice that someone has thought about a possibility of other sources, because we were thinking for an enough broad concept to introduce all of these varieties of autobiographical whatever, because we felt in this case in that gatherings that sometimes we have a very narrow frame for the autobiographical genre, because of the necessity of modern literary critics to frame the very different genres in the 20th century, 19th century, 20th century. But we feel that the same can be made for the Middle Ages. Yeah, that's interesting.
If I may, the most famous autobiographical text, sometimes labeled as autobiography, is in fact a letter, which is your Storia Calamitatum of Abelard. And all that follows is presumably an exchange of letters between him and Heloise. Now, the discussion goes, as far as, well, it's not, this is not about democracy, but a lot of people think that this is not really an exchange of letters, but rather a forged thing or something like, you know, a text that appears to be an exchange of letters, but it is not. It is like 100 years later that all this is put together, whatever that is. But of course, letters are a very important point. And then you have, you know, where you can prove that they are real letters. Of course, like Howard just said, they also contain a lot of information about personality in the Middle Ages, no doubt about that.
Excellent, thank you. And Juliana just put in the chat that she has actually just written a book on medieval English self-narratives with a section on letters. So let's keep talking, and that's the beauty of these webinars, that we hope that even more networks and collaboration can come up out of these. So thank you for that. So to just continue with the questions that are appearing on the chat. There's a question from Simon Doubleday, to all panelists again, whether you could comment a little bit more on the legacy of spiritual autobiographical writing, so from Augustine through Guibert de Nogent to Marjorie Kent. So is there any extent to which what we call secular autobiography in the Middle Ages or later is actually shaped by this legacy?
Do you want to answer, Aphrodisia? I think you can.
I can certainly give. I can certainly try. I can certainly try to sort of engage the question of the legacy of sort of spiritual writing. Most of the texts that I work on, in some ways, seem to be almost writing against sort of spiritual autobiography. I almost quoted I almost brought an excerpt specifically where Joinville is he's about to be killed. He thinks he's about to be killed, and all the men around him want to rush to this one monk because they want to confess. You know, as makes sense. You know, at when you think you're about to die, and Joinville's quote, and Joinville says, "quote." I couldn't remember anything wrong that I had done, so I didn't confess. That he was just totally uninterested in the genre of confession, that was not where he was going to sort of put his sort of autobiographical impulses. I mean, that said, I do think that that, you know, in a culture where confession is sort of part and parcel of of the experience of self-expression, it must have sort of that legacy of sort of spiritual autobiography must have it must have some sort of traction in the more sort of secular autobiography. But again, I think there are people who are much more sort of expert in spiritual autobiographies, and everything I've seen in the secular autobiographies really just seem to work against that.
May I add something to Simon's question?
Of course.
When I read my sources, let's say historical autobiographies by Jaume I and Peter Terceronius, I wonder until what extent they wrote this as a way to understand their own place in the world, meaning that they start saying that they are kings because of the grace of God, and they are keeping naming the name of God and how God is doing his action through their deeds, the king's deeds. So to me, it's very problematic to distinguish a secular and spiritual sphere. At least in the Middle Ages, I don't have particular experience in early modern, which perhaps France can add something, but I think there is no a specific way to approach autobiography, say I'm going to write a secular or more spiritual autobiography, because for them all the things lead to God, so and they have to be instruments of God. So for me, these two autobiographies, at least, they are kind of spiritual autobiography in the sense that they are kings and they are not outside the world as religious people, but they are doing God's action do. This is my first thought about this interesting question.
I mean, well, of course, Santi, you're totally right. Well, I think there is a distinction between kind of secular and religious autobiographies, if you may use these words, which are a bit difficult. But like, for instance, monks and even kings, of course, I remember the autobiography of Charles IV, the German emperor, since they represent also, you know, a kind of even emperors and even kings represent religion, faith, church, and Christ in a way. So of course they link their autobiographical text to the other sphere, so to speak. You won't find these things in those autobiographies or autobiographical texts I'm looking at when I look at, for instance, Burkhard Zink, a wealthy but not too rich merchant of Augsburg, or you know the Gian Filiazzi or others. But what they share, what these monks and kings and merchants, when they write about themselves, and again in hybrid texts like in chronicles or something like that, this Burkhard Zink wrote a chronicle of Augsburg, and then you have a big part, several pages, where he wrote about his family life and his personal feelings. What they share is they always want to be like Guy von Audion. He is the perfect monk at the end of the day. He is specially called by God to be a monk, something like that. And of course, merchants are not called by God to be a perfect merchant, but they are, you know, special in a way that, you know, they are better than the rest, but not different from the rest. They emphasize that they know, you know, the concepts, the values of their trade and of their social strata, so to speak, but then to distance themselves from the social strata without breaking the ties is precisely by describing themselves as being better. And when you look at Rousseau, which came up several times, he himself links directly to Augustine, as everybody knows. But when you look at his text, it's a complete different text. He says, you know, I'm the only one, no one else can be compared with me. And that, I think, is a real shift and a real break. So the question was, is modern autobiography inspired by medieval or pre-modern, be it secular or non-secular autobiographical text? Of course it is inspired, look at Rousseau, but of course it is very different, look at Rousseau.
Thanks, everyone. There's another, well, there are plenty more questions, and we might not be able to answer all of them within the hour when we are in live stream, but please stay with us because we will answer to the questions if you just stay on just for a few more minutes after 6. There's one more question that is addressed to all panelists from Francisco Garcia Serrano. It's a very broad question. I think it's a very interesting one. It's very broad, but I think it would be good to gather some ideas. So the question from Francisco is, how do you see the perception of otherness and gender within the examples of autobiographies that you have discussed?
I could talk.
Any volunteer who would like to start?
I could talk all day, so I was going to let the gentleman speak first.
No, Pradisha, go.
So again, using Joinville as an example, I mean, the otherness, obviously, the text is rife with otherness because we're on the crusade and he's encountering another culture. And what I found really interesting about that particular text is the way in which he uses that other culture and projects things onto that other culture, specifically to sort of prop up his own sort of autobiographical project and his own sort of worldview. He also, though, has it's not a sort of a east is east and west is west. It's much more sort of complicated as it was in the Middle Ages, and it's otherness underscored with a kind of, I don't know what we call it, sort of easy misunderstanding, so that his text can benefit by the presence of people that he doesn't quite understand. In terms of gender, and again, I was kind of struck by what Franz was saying, which is essentially that many autobiographies are just narcissistic projects, right? That you have to be you have to think that you are better than other people in order to be inspired to sort of produce these texts. And I think the same is the case with particularly with Joinville and his relationships to women. Again, he's going to use them to show why he is special and why he is different. Now, there's a lot of women's texts which have a sort of autobiographical sort of impulses in them in the Middle Ages and certainly in the modern period. And one of the things that I find most striking about what happens in the modern period is when feminists sort of get their hands on the genre and they start expressing like what the genre does differently for women in the modern period than it does for men, then autobiography no longer looks like Rousseau's Confession, right? It's no longer I am this special creature. It's more I am a person that am the person I am because of this community of people that I belong to. Like my autobiography is actually a larger autobiography. It's a collective autobiography, and but that idea of collective autobiography is very, very much present. And I think Franz was talking about this, like in the Middle Ages, autobiography looks different because relationships were different. And so these ideas about the individuality, right, or this person as an island unto themselves, that this is almost a rare form of autobiography. If you really look at what expressions of self are, it is really about people's relationships with other people. And you see this float to the surface more with women and with people coming from other cultures, particularly in the modern period, because you don't have the privilege of saying like, I'm just this wonderful individual woman and I'm better than everybody else and nothing else really matters, because that's just not your lived experience. So that's my sort of my 2 cents, and I could kind of go on, but I really do think that modern autobiography and sort of opening up different kinds of autobiography that don't sort of focus on sort of like a male European perspective have really helped sort of us think about different ways that we might think about autobiography in general, right? And really helped us see other kinds of texts in the Middle Ages.
If I may step in when it comes to this gender question, I'm not an expert at that. I would like to point out to the dissertation project of Lena Gumpert here in Bielefeld. So everything that seems plausible to you comes from Lena Gumpert. Everything which seems foolish comes from me. She is looking at Abelard and Heloise and the exchange of letters. And of course, in the first part of the letter collection, if it is a letter collection, but we don't discuss this here right now, Heloise is a kind of this typical woman we imagine be prominent in the Middle Ages. She is very sensual. She wants more attracted to sexuality, and the man is the monk is saying, well, we have to live a spiritual life. But then if you look at the second part and the last letters, this all changes. then Abela goes, you are my wife, and since you're a nun, you are the wife of Jesus Christ. So you are the perfect person to ask Jesus for my soul to be, I don't know the wording exactly, but to be saved or something like that. And then he goes on and on to point out two examples from the Bible where women are more cherished by God than men. So what I'm trying to say is that, yes, of course, gender is a very, very strong, and again, I have to point out to the work of Nina Gumpert, is a very, very strong thing in the Middle Age, but the categories are totally different, and they may even shift from, if I may say so, from prostitute to nun in the same text during the conversation. It's a conversio for both of them, for Abela and for Heloise. Well, this is not my idea, but this has been discussed for a long time. But and gender is used in that sense, and the strong person at the end of this letter exchange, in a way, not totally, but in a way, is Heloise and not Abela.
Excellent. And we even finished on time. So first of all, I would like to thank once again our amazing panelists for the extremely inspiring discussion that raised plenty of questions. So we are closing this webinar now simply for the live stream. If attendees would like to stay on, we're more than happy to hang out and answer, because there's still some very interesting questions that we just didn't have time to cover all of them. So we say bye for now, just for the World Wide Web, and we are staying here for a little bit longer. So thank you, everyone.